Hello and welcome to the second day of the 6th official edition of Politico's Healthcare Summit. I'm Ashley Furlong, a healthcare reporter at Politico. For those of you who were able to join us yesterday, you would have listened in to discussions on topics such as pandemic preparedness and the pharmaceutical strategy. You also would have heard from people such as Emma Cook, Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, and Anthony Fauci, Director of the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Today we have another stellar lineup of sessions, and I'd like to thank our partners for making this possible. In particular, our leading partner Janssen, and our presenting partners Tiva, Lilly, Viatris, and the Global Self-Care Federation. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping tips. Please do ask questions via the Swapcard platform. All instructions are on the event website. You can ask questions at the bottom right of the screen, and if you're using a desktop, that's if you're using a desktop, and below the live stream if you're on a mobile. And if you're lucky enough to be in the room with us today, please also use Swapcard to ask all your questions. And finally, please tweet about the events today using the hashtag #PoliticoHealthcare. Kicking us off today is a panel discussion on the EU's vaccine diplomacy efforts. It couldn't be a better time to talk about this. Just last week, we had European leaders calling for more urgent vaccine sharing and for the obstacles to donating doses to be removed. We also had the World Health Organization's Director General saying that the only thing that's holding us up, bringing doses to low-income countries, is politics and profit. The latest figures Politico had were that of the 250 million doses EU countries have promised to donate by the end of this year, just 56 million have actually been delivered. So there can really be, I think, no argument that things aren't where we hoped they would be. I'm going to introduce you to our speakers. We have a really great panel. Calling from South Africa, we have Helen Rees, Executive Director of the Wits Reproductive Health and HIV Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand. Hi, Helen.
Hi there.
Joining us from Sweden, we have Janine Alm Eriscon, Sweden State Secretary for International Development Cooperation. Hi, Janine.
Hi.
We also have Simon White, Independent Consultant in Quality of Medicines Distribution. Hi, Simon.
Morning, Ashley. Morning, all.
Morning. And finally, we have Martin Seychell, Deputy Director General of DG International at the European Commission. Hi, Martin.
Hello, good morning.
I wanted to start with a very brief question to all of you. What you think of the current situation with regards to vaccines distribution. Do you think that there's hope that we could be on course to get to a place that resembles some form of vaccine equity, in the short sort of term? Helen, would you like to start?
Well, if you ask about the short term, then I'm certainly not optimistic. I think from the African regional perspective, and I chair WHO's African Regional Advisory Committee on Vaccines and Immunization, we are extremely worried about the slowness in getting vaccines to the region. This has had all sorts of consequences. It has meant that we've allowed the virus to continue. We've seen variants emerge, and that will continue as long as we don't get coverage. But a consequence that perhaps we hadn't anticipated is that if you don't give people vaccines and you have misinformation and access to social media, which of course our region certainly does, then you grow vaccine hesitancy. So by not actually saying there is a priority and we're going to get vaccines out there, it's a big problem. As you know, about less than 4% overall in terms of the adult population have had access to a vaccine yet. So short term, I am not optimistic. But if I work with COVAX as well, the COVAX facility, and if I look at what we're anticipating, I think 2022 we should do much better. But you're absolutely right to have these discussions because we have a lot of self-questioning to do about how the world distributed vaccine. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Janine, would you like to give that question a go?
Thank you. And yes, my picture is unfortunately not so much different from that one of Helen just gave us. In the short term, it looks quite difficult and not at all good. We having problems with getting all the legal frameworks in place. When they are in place, we have other difficulties in doing the deliveries fast enough. But there's also very much work being done, and there's much to be learned, and that we have learned, and that we will have the opportunity to bring to making it better next year. And Sweden is, of course, doing everything we can to speed up these different issues, and we are doing as much as we can to donate both doses and dollars so that there could be as much work with this as possible.
Thanks, Janine. I'll get to sort of Sweden's role with COVAX in just a moment. Simon, what are your thoughts on where we are at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. I have to agree with both Janine and Helen. I think we have to ask some serious questions as to what is in our current ways of doing things has allowed us to get to this situation where, a vast majority of the world is way behind the WHO target for the end of this year. As Helen, I think, mentioned around 4% in the lower income countries being vaccinated. What has allowed us to get to this situation where certain regions have to depend on donations and charity? So this is always was going to be an immense logistical task to distribute the vaccines around the world. Immense work has already been done, but there are some serious questions, I think, in looking at this disparity and the lack of equity and access to vaccines.
Thanks, and finally, Martin.
Yes, well, there are three main challenges that I think are emerging quite clearly from the current situation. First is that this is a need for vaccination on an unprecedented scale. Vaccinating 70% of the world's population requires at least 11 billion vaccine doses. And as we speak now, in mid-October, just over 6.5 million doses have been administered worldwide. So clearly, this is unprecedented effort, but still far from enough. So that first is a problem of scale. Second is a problem of distribution. Clearly, we have the situation where it's an equivalent situation to having a building where you have not enough fire extinguishers, and the fire extinguishers you do have are maybe not evenly distributed. They're all in one place or in a few places. We know, for example, the situation in Africa has already been mentioned. Africa is lagging behind, but also within Europe itself, we still have also parts of the population that are not yet vaccinated and difficult to reach. Thirdly, an issue which is also emerging more and more clearly, and this will be, I think, an added complication in the months ahead, is how to reconcile the fact that you will have countries around the world at different phases in this vaccination strategy. You have countries that have already reached a certain level of vaccination, but will need to consolidate those gains in view of waning immunity, etc. So the whole problem, the whole issue of booster shots, etc. You have countries that do have access, but still have problems to convince their population or to reach their population because of vaccine hesitancy or simply because of their size. And you have the countries that still do not have the access issue solved. So this will be a challenge. On the other hand, I do see some light at the end of the tunnel. The industry, I think, is ramping up its production capacity significantly. I think the situation by mid-2022 should be much better. And as you know, the European Union, despite the fact that Europe was and this still is in many respects an epicenter of the pandemic, we lost in Europe more than 750,000 people to COVID, not to be forgotten. Nonetheless, Europe has been from the very beginning very active in not only in financial support to COVAX, etc., but also in donating. And as you know, we've committed to donating 200 million doses directly from the European Commission by mid-2022, and another 300 million from our member states through Team Europe. So still a long way to go, but I think we have reasons to believe the situation should gradually improve.
Thanks, Martin. I actually have a question for you, about these difficulties in donating. We've been hearing about difficulties from, EU member countries about complex negotiations on liability, supply chain problems, manufacturing delays. I know the doses aren't coming from the Commission, but the Commission has been instrumental in helping these countries, make the agreements to actually donate doses. Could you outline some of the problems that countries are facing when they, are trying to donate excess doses from the EU to the rest of the world?
Well, first of all, I think the term excess doses, I think, is often misunderstood. It's not that there are doses sitting somewhere which are not being used. There is a lot of uncertainty still. I mentioned earlier, for example, the challenge we have about the unknowns in the months ahead, about the need for third booster shot, etc. So countries obviously have to weigh constantly the uncertainty. I mean, they need to protect their own populations while at the same time realizing, they've understood this from the very beginning, certainly here in Europe, that we will not be out of this problem before everyone is out of the problem. So how to reconcile this is not easy. Secondly, there is an overall supply problem. Indeed, I think this is one of the key lessons learned. I think there are, of course, significant efforts underway to increase production, but we obviously will need to draw a key lesson here for the future, that for future pandemics, we will need to produce many more vaccines much more quickly. So there is something here we have to look at the business model, and maybe I could come to that later, what we need to do elsewhere in the rest of the world. But it is also, I think there is a need for greater flexibility also in the country, especially in the months ahead, to find this delicate balance between unknowns and knowns, the need to vaccinate elsewhere in the world, and also the need to be prepared to reinforce our existing vaccination campaigns here in Europe. We will need to have more flexibility and to be able to move much faster to use every single dose that is available in the best possible way.
I think that brings me nicely onto a question for Simon. You're talking about supply chains and difficulties with, manufacturing difficulties. Simon, you've worked for many years in the pharmaceutical industry. You don't anymore, but you understand the industry perspective really well. We're hearing from the WHO that they just don't have insight into, how many doses are coming from manufacturers and when they're coming. Is this because the supply chains are just so complex that, the manufacturers aren't able to sort of have sight of the next couple of weeks? Or, could these vaccine makers be doing more to provide that information to these global distribution mechanisms?
Yeah, vaccine and pharmaceutical manufacturing and supply is highly complex by nature and globalized. I probably don't agree that there is that lack of ability to have visibility on what is coming, what is planned in production. I think there's very good control and visibility on planning to meet demand. The supply chain and manufacturing processes are very tuned into demand, so they're designed to be variable, to fluctuate, to be able to meet demand. I'm talking in general for pharmaceuticals. And any sort of incident or event that, if you like, puts a spanner in the works of that finely tuned supply process is an added hurdle that, frankly, we could do without. I just give some examples. A critical one that is a risk of causing shortages and was during 2020, probably still is the ability of national governments to ban the movement of medicines. So restriction of exports, for example, whether it's from a manufacturing location, which supplies potentially a global population with a single product, or a distribution center, which happens to be located at a geographically central point through which transits a vast amount of volume of pharmaceutical product and range of products. That individual nation being able to restrict movement immediately puts a burden on the supply chain and the ability of the supply chain to actually get those products to the populations who are in need. So these are the kind of geopolitical issues that actually add to the problem of shortages. And the response that we saw through 2020 was issues such as stockpiling and hoarding, which actually don't solve the problem. I mean, this is an additional hurdle to the finely tuned supply process, which inherently has buffer stock and safety stock to be able to negotiate these kind of difficulties.
I think it's also then interesting to look at sort of a case study of Sweden where they've actually managed to donate a significant amount of doses through COVAX, and it's the biggest per capita contributor to COVAX. Janine, what's different about the Swedish approach to donating doses, and do you think your fellow EU countries are is there political will to donate doses elsewhere? Why is Sweden different in this regard?
Well, I guess others have to reply to that, but the pandemic has also shown us that the world needs strong collective action, and that there has to be a political courage and a greater joint responsibility. This is true with the COVID pandemic, but it's also true with the climate crisis, for example. So there's really a need for more international cooperation and strong. Sweden wants to lead by example here, as in other areas, if we have the possibility to do so. And we have really taken seriously the thing that if not, no one is safe until everyone is safe. We know that saying by now, many are saying it, but it also takes that you have to walk the walk with that. And that is why we have put in much money in our coming budget, also for this year, but also trying to be really proactive in donating doses. But as I said before, it has been quite cumbersome process, both legally and process-wise. But we really hope that we will now come together and daring to do. I think it was Martin who says we have to be in between of what we know what to do and not know, and daring to do a bit more. So I really hope that there will be more action on this, and that COVAX will have all what they need to provide for other countries, because of course the figures of vaccination is really low in some countries, and it is a reality that we will have to deal with this for so much longer if we do not get this donation working properly.
Helen, I've been hearing that there is a significant trust deficit from African leaders, in particular in the EU, because of this. The European countries promised equity and solidarity, but we aren't in that situation with vaccines. What further effect do you think it will have if EU countries aren't able to meet these promises in the next couple of months?
Well, I think this lack of trust. If we went back to the pandemic flu in 2009, the region then got access to vaccines months after the pandemic had come and gone, and so we said this should not happen again, and so COVAX was established. But there were delays in funding of COVAX. There were delays in supplies of COVAX. And the African Union took the lead. At that time, President Ramaphosa was the lead, and he took a very vocal lead about the demand for vaccines, which we had never seen before from African leaders. But we'd already had this very negative experience with the previous pandemic. So the good news is that I think that the African leadership is now taking a lead and also demanding the right to manufacture, because, as was said, we've seen countries, including India, the US, etc., closing their ranks and saying it's us first, and nothing goes out. Now, I think we all understand the reality of national politics, that politicians have to think about their own constituencies. But what we didn't have was a framework that all politicians, all leaders could say to their countries, we are going to look after you, our citizens, you voted us in. But we are also going to commit. We have a commitment, a global structure. What we saw instead was a structure that actually seems to have been driven by traditional profit. The Forbes top 100 now has got 3 new billionaires in it who have become billionaires because of COVID vaccines. So that we haven't changed the framework. And that's why the African leadership has had to say, we want to see something different. We are now seeing a large commitment in the region to manufacturing. That will help. What has to go with manufacturing is investment in research, because you don't get vaccines just into a factory. They don't start in a factory, they start on the research bench. So we also have to invest in vaccines. And there are many diseases in our region that have epidemic and pandemic potential for which we have no vaccines. So in terms of, having a different structure, I think the world needs to say, in the case of a pandemic, structure that allows leaders of all countries to say, this is the framework we're all going to follow. We are going to guarantee that no country will be left behind. And that what is going to drive this will not be profit. It will be global good. We haven't got that framework yet. And I think that's the sort of dialogue we have to take forward.
And speaking about those manufacturing efforts, we have an mRNA hub in South Africa. Just 2 days ago, BioNTech set out its plans for a site in Rwanda. We don't have all the details, but it seems like there is money and political will to change the situation on the African continent. Martin, what role is the EU going to play in the next couple of months? I suppose the next year, this is a really important time to dramatically speed up this manufacturing capacity in Africa.
Yes, we plan to play a very active role in support of the clear call and leadership shown by the African Union and its leaders to really address the basic problem, which is that Africa imports 99% of its vaccines and 94% of its medicines. This is not just about vaccines, by the way. Africa is dependent for a lot of other things. And it's not just about COVID either. In fact, where it comes to Africa, as bad as the impact of COVID is, it's dwarfed by other diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and also a whole host of forgotten diseases which are not always on the research radar. So we are definitely committed to address that. As you know, President von der Leyen earlier this year announced a €1 billion Team Europe initiative on manufacturing and access to vaccines, medicines, and health technologies in Africa in response to that clear call from the African Union. And this is, we need to act on 3 areas, basically. First is to address the supply side. So research, looking at how we can de-risk investment. And there are already clear signs that the more innovative sectors of the industry are looking to Africa also with greater interest. And that's a sign something we should pick up and really encourage. Secondly, there's also the demand side. How to consolidate the demand for vaccines and medical technologies. Africa is 54 countries, and that means there's a lot of fragmentation. But there's also possibilities now offered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. Again, another area where there is a lot of African leadership, which we are fully in support of. And consolidating that demand will obviously go a long way to making Africa a much more attractive market as well. And thirdly is the regulatory side. The pharmaceutical sector, and vaccines are part of that, needs to be and must be highly regulated. And here again, Africa is showing leadership by setting up the African Medicines Agency. That is proceeding, although I must note that not all African countries are on board, and that's something which needs to be addressed. But definitely, this would go a long way, because it would mean that you could have much speedier regulatory approval. There could be the possibility then of also channeling support from the European Medicines Agency to the African Medicines Agency. I'd like here to also commend the excellent work done by the African CDC under the leadership of Dr. John Nkengasong, who's really, in the few years it's been established, has really made a difference. And I think it's shown that we need to put all these elements together. So we will be acting in support of these 3 pillars of work, also mobilizing Team Europe members. And it's not just a question of money, it's also a question of really supporting Africa with the necessary expertise. And Europe, if I may say, is ideally placed to do this, because we are the only regional regulatory body in the world so far. So, and therefore, we are a natural partner for Africa in this regard.
Thanks, Martin. Simon, these are big ambitions, but I think there's a lot of questions about whether, these new facilities will be able to be up and running, during the current pandemic. How optimistic are you that, this will move fast enough?
I think with the right investment and resource, as previous speakers mentioned, that this has to be a collaborative effort. We're late. I think there's willingness now. There's a sort of a wake up call that things could have been done better and should be done better next time round. And part of that preparation will be investment in manufacturing capability, especially on the African continent. I heard a speaker from the African Union last week, mention, anything that can be done in India can be done in Africa. They have the resource, they have the expertise, and the ability to do this. So yes, if the investment and the willingness is there, there's no reason. I think we saw yesterday, mid 2022, the previous mention of Rwanda, Senegal, South Africa. These countries are preparing, so things are kicking off. The added, I guess, challenge in the African continent especially is the infrastructural difficulty and climate extremes, which make especially cold chain distribution, supply chain particularly difficult as well. So, it's not a simple process, but I think the willingness and the investment is there. We know from, for example, the future pharmaceutical strategy from a European perspective as well. Manufacturers have raised the point that pharmaceutical manufacturing will become segmented in the future. We have a more segmented range of product types, with more sort of personalized gene therapy, for example. So very specialized at one extreme, and then still the need for the large volume, let's say older, more simply manufactured products. We've seen in this pandemic that the global nature of the supply chain is vulnerable to political pressures, movement restrictions, etc. And so I think a fragmentation, a segmentation of the manufacturing processes and locations will be a sort of a natural evolution.
Thanks, Simon. And I want to sort of look more broadly. You mentioned this, and I think Helen mentioned this earlier about relying on donations and sort of the situation that we've ended up in. This is not what COVAX was originally set out to do. We weren't supposed to be relying on donations. Janine, looking to the future, to the next pandemic, should we be emulating the model of COVAX again? How does it need to change for the future?
The first and most important thing we have to do is to try to really prevent another pandemic, and that is, of course, by treating the climate change and the biodiversity crisis, for example, but also building stronger healthcare systems. But on changing COVAX, I think that we now have to really, the situation we're currently in is an historical situation, and what needs to be done, we have to learn from this experience and going forward. And I think we have to be courageous enough to also say that really point out what was not working here. The economic framework might be one, but also political will, because as Helen said, there is a middle way between, or a way to say to your own constituencies that we are going to take care of you. But in a global crisis like a pandemic, taking care of your own constituency is also taking care of others because of the variance and because that we are interconnected. So we are dependent on each other, and that's what takes courageous global leadership when there is issues like this that affects the whole world at the same time.
Thanks, Janine. Helen, do you think COVAX has failed in its ambitions?
Well, it certainly hasn't achieved the ambitions. As I say, I'm working on several COVAX committees. It hasn't achieved what we would have liked to have achieved as quickly as possible, but I think it's done something very important, which is to say this is one global framework. We know that Gavi, that is the key partner driving the COVAX facility, has been an enormously successful initiative to get vaccines out to the poorest countries in the world, and to get vaccine coverage up and to save literally millions of lives. That was the same model. It hasn't been as successful, and I think we're trying to understand why. And one of them, as I say, is early on, we didn't get the amount of investment from countries as we would have liked, and we didn't get the buy-in from the manufacturers, and we got this sealing off of borders and not exporting these vaccines that were being developed in the rich countries. So but as I say, if you look to 2022, things look much better, because some of that is now beginning to change with both donations and funding and the buy-in, the bigger buy-in from the manufacturers. But if this is a model that we want to have for the future, then we are going to have to ask some very strong questions about how do we put it on a shelf and ensure that it's there and it's going to continue and be ready to press a button. And how do we ensure that all of those things that prevented a really rapid startup, which was required, are then addressed? I think that the idea of having something for pandemics that has a similar view to that of Gavi, which is to say we are going to invest immediately and carefully to protect the least well-resourced countries of the world, to make sure there is equity. That idea, I do not think we should drop. We must hang on to it. If we need to make adjustments, then we must do it and we must learn.
One sort of final chance, if any of the speakers want to add to that or give their thoughts on, to the future. We only have about a minute left.
Could I just say one thing?
Sure.
I think we can learn from the experience of HIV. The antiretrovirals were available in rich countries, and the language that was spoken in those days was Africa can never manage a complex schedule like antiretrovirals. And we showed that was wrong, but we also showed that you can have a healthy marketplace that takes the whole world into account, rich and poor. Gavi has shown that actually by incorporating all countries, you can have a healthy marketplace and you can predict for manufacturers the marketplace. So we should do the same for pandemics and learn from those lessons.
Very briefly, in 2 sentences, Martin.
Yes, well, we have a system, obviously, which was designed not to deal with these kind of massive pandemics with such duration, but to deal with let's say, normal infectious disease outbreaks. But I'd like here also to show that they emphasize the importance of political courage. I mean, Europe, despite the fact that we've been at the epicenter of this pandemic with 750,000 dead, we've not blocked our exports. I mean, the European Union has exported already over 1 billion doses to over 150 countries. So yes, is that enough? No, much more needs to be done. Key lesson learned is we need to increase global production capacity, and we need also to make sure it's much better distributed. So responding to the calls from Africa and others.
And Simon, as a last takeaway, I know you wanted to say something.
Very quick comment. I would say all countries should have a seat at the table when it comes to discussions on allocation of doses during a pandemic or in response to a pandemic. So there should not be a reliance on so-called extra doses, donations, charity. It should be an equitable process from the beginning.
I think that's a great line to end on. Thank you to our great speakers. And the next panel will be on reconciling innovation and health needs, and it will be moderated by my colleague, Helen Collis. If you are in the room, please remain seated, as the next session will begin in just a few minutes. And if you're at home, you can go and grab a coffee.